G'day everyone, my name's Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute and welcome to our webinar series. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Canberra is Ngunnawal country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And obviously we still have a huge amount of unfinished business in the push towards voice, treaty and for a truth-telling process as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. As with last year, we are aiming to do all these webinars at least weekly, but days and times do vary. You can find all the information for upcoming webinars on our website at australiainstitute.org.au, so don't miss out. Just a few tips before we begin to help this webinar run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions for our panelists. You should also be able to upvote other people's questions and make comments on them as well. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, otherwise we'll boot you out. We don't normally have to do that, but we will if we have to. So please keep things nice and civil in the chat. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it will be posted up on our website and emailed to everyone after the discussion if you have to leave for whatever reason. So it was only in November last year that the Brereton report was handed down. It was a landmark inquiry recommending that 19 Australian Defence Force soldiers be investigated by police for the murder of 39 prisoners and civilians in Afghanistan and the cruel treatment of 2 others. The war in Afghanistan is Australia's longest war. And as it stands, the Australian government has the power to take Australia to war without a debate or a vote in Parliament even. So today we want to discuss not the accountability of our armed forces, but how the government is or is not accountable for what our armed forces do in armed conflict that the government sends them to. And joining me for this discussion today is former Green Senator and author Scott Ludlam, Vice President of Australians for War Powers, Dr. Alison Broinowski, and Head of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs Program, Allan Behm. G'day, Alison, Scott and Allan. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Ebony.
Morning.
Good morning.
I'm going to start off with you, Scott, as a former senator who I think had a private member's bill on this very issue. What are the current processes for committing Australian forces to war? What happens?
Well, I guess the purpose of this conversation this morning is to remind ourselves collectively that there are no current processes. It's a decision of the Prime Minister, not even the Prime Minister and Cabinet. So there's almost no formal process at all. There's certainly a lot that would go on behind the scenes, but the enormous problem that we've got in Afghanistan is one rather nasty example of it. Of course, Vietnam is another, Iraq is another, is that these decisions are made behind closed doors, which sets aside all of Parliament's accountability mechanisms. As flawed and brittle as they can be, it completely sets them aside and either invokes them in a non-binding way, as we saw during successive Australian deployments into Iraq, or it invokes them after the fact. And you have Parliament basically scrambling to establish what is the purpose of this engagement, what's it for, how long are we going to be there, what's it going to cost, and it's a dramatically unsatisfactory state of affairs. So I imagine we're going to spend a bit of time talking about it today, but one of the proposals that has been actually sitting in Parliament since 1985, since the Australian Democrats introduced it, is a proposal to shift that war-making power, that so-called the war power, from the executive government to the Parliament so that it needs to be put to a vote. And there's a bill which was introduced by the Democrats. I picked it up. Senator Jordan Steele-John has since adopted it and introduced it back into Parliament, which creates this very streamlined process for making that possible. That's the first thing. The second thing, which I think is really important in this context, is that we assume that it's a decision solely of the Prime Minister. But what really happens is that these decisions are made in Washington, DC. That's a much deeper question about the entanglement of Australian foreign and defence policy with that of the United States government. And I don't think it's really possible to address one without the other.
Alison, I'll come to you next. how do we get into this position, particularly if there's been kind of proposals on the books since 85 to kind of change this situation? I mean, is there anything that actually constrains the Parliament from insisting on some accountability when it comes to taking Australia to war?
Well, there's plenty. And the reason is that we have a constitution which permits what Scott has just described, the Prime Minister of the day, virtually alone, to make a decision on the spot to send Australian troops to war, because, I would suggest, our constitution was written by the British for its colonies. The New Zealanders and the Canadians have similar ones, and they wanted colonial troops to be available to fight in British wars. And so they put as few constraints in the way of sending those troops as possible. What they did was, when Australia became a so-called independent country in 1901, it was simply made possible in the Constitution for the Governor-General to approve, in effect, the advice of the Prime Minister, who's not mentioned in the Constitution, and off they went. Now, that remains the case. It has never changed, and that's why it can happen. And all of our wars have been entered in that manner, both before and after the Second World War. The only difference is that before the Second World War, it was British wars that we went to at British request, or on our assumption that we should. And after 1945, all of them were American wars to which we went either because we volunteered or because the Americans asked us to. And so in every case, it's the Prime Minister of the day who accepted that advice or that request or volunteered it, and simply said, nowadays through the National Security Committee of Cabinet, this is what we're going to do, and then announced it. Now, they know, governments know, that people are nervous about this. The displeasure of the people was made very clear about the Iraq War in 2003. It was ignored, and thousands of people marched, and their opinions were disregarded. They got away with it because, as always, once the troops are in the field, people don't vote against a government that is administering them. And that is the extraordinary situation that continues to this day. We have, as Scott said, troops in Afghanistan in the longest war we've ever fought. There's no sign of our winning it. We haven't won any of the wars that he mentioned, not one. And if this was a business that the Australian government was running, and for 70 years, we kept doing the same thing without achieving what we said we were going to achieve, that is victory in this case, and we spent massive amounts of people's money as well as lives on this and caused massive amounts of damage worldwide. What sort of business, I ask, would survive a shareholders meeting? Now take us as the shareholders. Surely the shareholders should be saying, what is going on here? Now, a lot of shareholders, as you might call voters out there and people with an opinion in the public, do have these concerns, but their concerns are not listened to. Why? Because governments make damn sure that in the Parliament there is no such opportunity. The opposition had a debate in 2003 about Iraq and expressed their disaffection with the whole idea of going to war, but they were ignored because the government can, and did again in 2015 when Tony Abbott sent troops to recommitted the troops to Iraq and then to Syria, when Malcolm Turnbull put the RAF into Syria. At no point were the Australian people consulted through the Parliament.
Yeah, so that's a point I want to pick up on and come back to you, Scott. So obviously we can all see that the reason why governments don't take this to the Parliament is because the Parliament might oppose such deployments. But I mean, walk me through what the Parliament can do and what some of the accountability mechanisms might be if such decisions were taken to the Parliament. What does that look like in Parliament itself?
I think the process that the bill sets out is actually quite streamlined, because it envisages that you're only going to be having a debate like that in a crisis. So it doesn't deal with with deployment of the ADF into emergencies or climate disasters or exercises or that kind of thing. It's principally concerned with crisis situations where a deployment is called for. And so it doesn't have, months-long committee processes attached to it. It's quite a streamlined piece of legislation. But the purpose of it really is to say, if the executive government can't persuade half its parliament, so it can't persuade the other major party that's in opposition and the crossbench, if you can't persuade half of your own parliament that this deployment is in the public interest, then there's something deeply wrong with the argument that you're putting. So what it basically does is it says the executive government needs to come to both houses of parliament and pass and win a resolution, a vote, on the basis of information that it puts to the parliament. This has been conflated by opponents of the bill with giving away your tactics to the enemy and destroying any kind of strategic advantage you might have. And it's very clear in that it's not laid out to do that. It is about purpose. What is the purpose of this? What is the justification for this engagement? Leave the tactics to the tacticians. Leave the conduct of the engagement to the people who know what they're doing. That's not Parliament's role. But cutting Parliament out of that key decision, which says we don't trust half of our elected legislators, that if we can't persuade half of our elected legislators. So I feel like that's the first real problem. But the other one, which I feel like it's worth continually coming back to, is that so many other states around the world have this power. It's effectively normalized in Europe, in the UK, effectively, and Dr. Broinowski, correct me if I've got this wrong, they have effectively a convention now rather than a legislated war power within Westminster, and that was embedded after the government's attempt to deploy into Syria. And the United States, as flawed and as much of a debacle as congressional processes are, the United States has that war power vested in Congress. And I suggest that the reason we don't, and the reason that we've seen in vote after vote, Australian parliamentarians voting against accruing that power to themselves, is that the United States government doesn't want that. It prefers to keep things flexible, where literally on a handshake with John Howard in 2001, he can get the ANZUS Treaty invoked and commit us to open-ended engagements wherever the United States government decides to deploy. I think that's why it's indivisible from me and many others working on this issue from the question of who actually sets foreign and defence policy in this country. Is it done in Canberra or is it done in DC? I don't think we can really disentangle the two.
Yeah, that might be a whole other webinar. Allan, I might come to you now, maybe just to respond to that. And I'm thinking also of if we're looking to other parliaments, what are some of those other accountability mechanisms? Because, Britain, for example, has been involved in a couple of the last wars that we have also disastrously, and they seem to have taken quite a different tack.
That's absolutely right, Ebony. Well, first of all, I'm in complete agreement with the principles that both Alison and Scott have set out, so I won't rehearse those. I'll make two practical observations, though, before I get on to how accountability sort of works in Britain. The first one is this. It's called preemptive decision-making. In the case of both Britain and Australia with respect to the Iraq War, the decision was made months and months and months before there was any actual Australian choice about sending any form of troop commitment. Prime Minister Howard immediately announced at 9/11 that the ANZUS Treaty would be invoked, and that, I think, set the stage for a whole series of consequential actions which had little to do with Australia's strategic interests and in fact were very damaging to our broader international reputation. My second point is a practical one. I've found in my discussion with newly arrived backbenchers into our parliament, that they're all very keen that there should be appropriate accountability of the executive to the parliament itself, until their seniors and quote unquote their betters remind them that if they're ambitious for a seat in the executive, then they ought to be very careful about having their rights and privileges and prerogatives subject to any external, by which I mean the parliament, review of what they might decide within the confines of the cabinet room. And I think a lot of the problem that we confront here is a structural problem within our government party, whoever that government party happens to be, whereby the party itself in the executive actually controls the way in which the conversation or the debate is run in the parliament. And I think that they're both very significant aspects of the problem that we're seeking to discuss this morning. Sorry, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Alison, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I thoroughly agree with Allan, and it has an extension. As you say, ordinary fair-minded people and newly elected politicians just don't even understand the ramifications of this problem until they come up against it. Now, we in Australians for War Powers Reform have been to see numerous politicians of all parties. We are a non-partisan organisation, and we have tried to get them interested right across the spectrum. Some get it, but a lot of backbenchers say, oh, we leave that to the senior members in our party. In other words, it's not our responsibility and we don't want it to be. That's complex. You know, the Senate committees that look after foreign affairs and intelligence and all of that sort of thing, they know what's going on, so we don't interfere with that. That's the typical backbench response. And it's a cop-out because it means that their democratic responsibility to their electors, when there is a war, to decide on their behalf if Australia should be involved in it, is abrogated. And so it gets passed up the line, and in effect, as we described before, it ends with the Prime Minister. So there is no effective oversight at all, let alone the accountability that Allan is talking about and that I was referring to when I said it's a bad business the way we're running it, because we're just spending money and wasting lives for no good purpose at all. Now, the second point, that's the political side of it, but the deep state political aspect of it is, as Scott said, the fact that the policies are made not in Australia at all. Foreign policy and defence policy are so-called bipartisan in recent years. That is to say, there is no opposition to what the government wants to do. The reason there is no opposition, I suggest, is that the opposition too wants to get into government. It too doesn't want to have its hands tied by the sort of responsibility to the electorate that we've been discussing. And furthermore, they know, any opposition leader today knows that if he says, we are not going to automatically send troops to fight an enemy identified by the United States, if he said that, he would find his party surprisingly destabilized. The Americans are very good at this. They do it in a lot of countries. In countries like ours, they do it in a more subtle manner. In other countries, they do it in a more brutal manner. But it is the truth. And they don't dare to tell the people that. And it's true.
Scott, I might come back to you now. I mean, taking up Alison's point there, just as a layperson, I cannot imagine a situation in which America kind of went to a war and Australia didn't go with it. That just seems to be kind of where our national debate always is and how our foreign policy unfolds. But I want to come back to accountability, I guess, because we've talked about various wars that we've been involved in that haven't gone very well. I mentioned at the beginning the Brereton report and dealing with the conduct of Australian soldiers overseas in armed conflict. Now, the Brereton report deals with the conduct of ADF members, but it seems to me it was almost entirely silent on accountability from the executive and what government's responsibility is for taking those decisions, and then the conduct of our soldiers in those kinds of conflicts. Can you talk to me a little bit about where is the accountability there?
Well, that's the key, isn't it? That's the key to this whole debate, is that the accountability is lacking, is that Australia's leadership in 2002 committed what most international legal scholars agree was a war crime. Under the United Nations Charter that Australia was one of the very first signatories to, you don't get to launch military invasions on other countries anymore. That's something that a planetary society agreed we would need to prohibit after the catastrophe of the Second World War. John Howard, who still pops up on Sky News every now and again and gets feted at Liberal Party conferences, is almost certainly a war criminal. So it goes all the way to the top. Tony Blair, no consequences. George W. Bush, no consequences. So I think what we saw in the Brereton report, and it's terrifying to see how rapidly that was firewalled in the media and kind of buried as rapidly as possible, is that you see this kind of vertical firewalling. So it's like, well, we're just going to end up blaming a couple of wayward soldiers and kind of narrow the case for responsibility as much as we can. But also that there's going to be this enormous pushback, I guess, and they're going to try and isolate that and just move it out of our collective memory as rapidly as possible. And that's, I guess, the kind of behavior that ensures this kind of thing will continue. So I think it's great, Ebony, that you mentioned that, because this is not just about a policy debate that would happen in Parliament. This is about very real consequences for human beings on the ground. This is what we're grappling with.
Allan, I'll come to you now. We've been talking a little bit about the Chilcot report and how there was kind of no equivalent here in Australia. For people who aren't aware of what that report is, can you just tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, Ebony. In about 2014 or 2013, the British government decided that it did need to have a look at what was entailed in the Blair government's decision to commit its forces to the Iraq War. And Sir John Chilcot was appointed to conduct a review. His review was a damning review, essentially around the issues of accountability. He went a little bit further than just accountability. He did look at issues of fact, and he came up with quite a long list of fundamental criticisms, and I can't run through them all now because it was a huge report, runs into millions of words. But his key judgments were that the UK had joined the invasion of Iraq before peaceful options had been exhausted, that Blair deliberately exaggerated the threat posed by Saddam Hussein, that he promised George Bush months in advance, "I'll be with you whatever," that the decisions made to invade were done so in unsatisfactory circumstances, that Bush ignored UK advice on post-war planning, there was no imminent threat from Saddam, that Britain's decision was made on flawed intelligence, that the UK military was ill-equipped for the task, that US-UK relations would not have been harmed had the UK stayed out of the war, that Blair ignored warnings about what would happen after the invasion, the government had no post-invasion strategy. Doesn't all this sound rather familiar? The UK had no influence on Iraq's post-war US-run administration, it had no objectives in Iraq, and the government didn't try hard enough to keep a tally of Iraqi civilian casualties. Now that's a long list, but the same mutatis mutandis would apply to Australia, that we were in exactly the same boat. I would just make one slight adjustment to the points that were made just a moment ago, that Australia's and Britain's decisions weren't actually made in the Pentagon or in the State Department or in the White House. what happens over there is they set the frame within which their allies take their consequential decisions. So our cabinet does make decisions totally dominated by the strategic and policy concerns of the United States, but we fit in as a subordinate partner, making our own decisions, such as they are, but largely premised upon a much broader US strategic calculus. You might say that there's no difference, but there is a bit, because we are then legally responsible for our decisions. The United States is not legally responsible for them. And that is at the heart of Chilcot's review also, in my opinion.
Mm. Alison, I'll come back to you on that. So we've got one example of how Britain, even post the fact, I guess, came back for some measure of accountability and accounting for UK government decisions. But thinking, I guess, recently of the Brereton report, can you comment on how Australians for War Powers Reform kind of sees that issue of executive accountability, perhaps after the fact of going to war? What are the other mechanisms of accountability that we need to be considering?
Well, in the first place, Australians for War Powers Reform grew out of a movement which was calling for an Iraq war, a campaign for an Iraq war inquiry, just the same as the Chilcot inquiry that Allan was describing, because we knew that Australia didn't have one. We thought we should have one, if only because we wanted to make sure that future wars of this sort and future war crimes would be avoided. Now, we couldn't get any traction from either government or opposition on this. Britain was lucky to do so. They just happened to have a change of government at the right time. We didn't. We never got an inquiry, and we're unlikely to ever get one, so that won't be done. And for that reason, we changed our campaign to an effort to change the war powers. But you talk about accountability. Here we are up against a further problem, because as Scott said, wars are not declared anymore. Wars don't happen out of a clear blue sky where a country is suddenly invaded, which means that the invader is in breach of their obligations under the UN Charter and international law. Wars are planned months and years in advance, and all the potential parties to those wars know about them. Now you say, Ebony, and my blood runs cold, you say, well, we just always go to wars. I can't imagine with the United States, I can't imagine us not doing so. Now, think about the implications of that. Think about what if the United States continues, as it has been doing for a decade or more, to plan a war against Iran. In more recent times, they have been planning a war in the South China Sea, which would be against China. If you're right, and if Australia automatically would find itself involved in both of those, just think about the implications. It's all very well to do an expeditionary war in the Middle East, but what about Australia being involved with a war against a country that is still our major trading partner, and which could very well, I'll talk about Iran in a minute, but China could very well decide, if such eventuality took place, to send a message to the United States by attacking US bases in Australia, because they don't care. Australia is neither here nor there. But if the United States was the enemy, and if Australia was involved in hostilities with China, that is a very likely possibility. Now, if you think that it's perfectly normal for us to be involved in that way, then I hope that not too many other people think the same way, because it is extremely different and extremely dangerous. Now, in the case of a more likely possibility, and that is even under the Biden administration, in fact, particularly under the Biden administration, it's quite likely that they, like every US administration, want a war. They want a little war. They want a winnable war to make them look as if they're great again. And they, particularly the now Secretary of State, the Defense Minister, the National Security Advisor, and the new head of the CIA are all dead set Iran enemies. And Biden even called Putin a killer the other day. I mean, these people are not in control. They're almost more frightening to me than Trump. Now, if they stirred things in such a way as to have a war with Iran, and if you're right, then Australia would be in it right away with no discussion and no debate, because it's been planned for months and months and months. Wars don't just happen. It takes a lot of planning to sort of turn the Queen Mary around and make it get there. They're doing that. They can pull it down off the shelf any minute. And you will be right in that respect, because Australia would be involved. Now,
yeah, look, I'm not saying that I am right. I'm certainly not an expert in these areas, but I guess the point of these discussions is it's discussions that we should be having in peacetime, well ahead of getting involved in any conflict. But it's been raised several times, I guess, that the idea that America leads Australia's foreign policy. Allan, can I just get you to talk a little bit more about that?
Look, Alison makes a very sort of powerful case, but I think that the strategic logic and strategic decision-making has many, many more steps in it than simply rushing from a declaration of some sort of situation by the United States and China to China deciding that it will attack US facilities, so-called, in Australia. I think there's much, much more in it than that. It's not to say that Australia has not got a predisposition to go wherever the United States goes. It's sort of hardwired into the way in which we think about our strategic dependency. But as I said a moment ago, there are still many decisions to be taken. And if you look at the precise nature of our contribution in Iraq, it went nowhere near what the United States actually asked us for. What they wanted was armoured regiments on the ground with sort of armed personnel carriers, tanks, and that kind of thing. What did we actually send? We sent the SAS so that they could stand on the hills and send in intelligence and watch. So Howard was very, very sensitive to losing people, to people who might get killed. And I think that exactly the same sets of calculus always apply to the nature of Australian contributions to the US. I think at the moment, complexity is beginning to weigh in on the way in which at least many of those who advise the government, that is within the civil service, are beginning to shape the way in which we should be thinking about our own long-term strategic options. They're not advising that we should walk away from the United States, but they are advising that we have a bigger role in offering counsel and advice. And I would strongly encourage them to amp that up a bit, because we must be free to choose our own way of delivering on our own long-term interests. And that, I think, goes to the heart of the point that Alison has been making and that you were touching upon in your earlier remarks. We've got to recalibrate and recondition the way in which we think about our alliance with the United States, not to walk away from it, but to make it work to our advantage rather than simply seeing it working to the advantage of US global strategic interests.
Indeed. Well, we might go now to questions from the audience. I can see we've got nearly 400 people online with us today. Thank you again for joining us for such an important discussion. Scott, I'm going to direct this first question to you. It's from Fiona Crosskill. She says, did the Parliament have any say in Australia recently becoming a weapon making and exporting country? I believe that was a Malcolm Turnbull innovation.
No, it didn't. That was policy conducted by press release. So no, it didn't. And that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah. And what are some of the implications for that, I guess, now where Australia finds itself?
I guess the implications are twofold. One is that they seem to be quite intent through people like Chris Pine and other pretty senior Australian officials who are now very enmeshed in military industries, they seem quite intent on increasing Australia's dependence on arms exports. And so kind of hijacking the imperative of rebuilding the Australian manufacturing sector, except now we're going to be designing, we're going to create an industrial dependence on this pretty toxic sector. And the other consequence is that there's now, there's potentially Australian equipment being deployed into catastrophes like Yemen, which is about as deeply unethical and immoral a use of Australian industrial capacity as you can imagine. So it's all kind of enmeshed together, I guess.
The next question is from Laurel Thomas, and I might give this one to you, Alison. It says, Paul Barrett says that the US did not welcome our troops into the Vietnam War, but that our Prime Minister volunteered our troops. Can you give any other instances where Australian troops have been volunteered and not asked for?
Yes, in fact, Paul's right. That was the case. And Menzies inspired a letter of invitation, which was hand-delivered by one of our diplomats to the government of South Vietnam and came back as a request for Australian troops. That's how that was done. We did the same, in effect, for Iraq, because we had people from the ADF training in the United States for years in preparation for this, because Iraq was on the list. Iraq was on the list of 7 countries which the United States intended from the mid-1990s to destabilize in the Middle East. That was the list put together by the neocons, the PNAC, the Project for a New American Century. We knew about that. We wanted to be in there. We had people training in the United States to be ready. And when John Howard wanted to send them, he said, look, we've got these people. They said to Condoleezza Rice. Condoleezza Rice said to George Bush, oh, we've got these Australians. They keep saying they want to be in it. That's how that was done. We invite ourselves as well as being invited. And that was what happened. In the case of Syria, I can't tell you, because they started to get very secretive indeed about what was going on. We still don't know how that was decided or who volunteered, but you can be quite sure that if a country like Australia is going to refuse a request from an ally for troops, that ally will be warned in advance not to put itself to the embarrassment of asking and being turned down. So in other words, there's a kind of a diplomatic dance that goes on. Well, is it okay for us to mention this? And we come back and say, well, mention away, because we look as if we're going to agree. That kind of stuff happens. And as I've said, none of these wars happen out of a clear blue sky, which is why it's so difficult for people like us trying to change the war powers to stop governments being able to do that. Because in fact, the war is never declared. It doesn't just happen. It is planned slowly and incrementally, and in what we used to call mission creep. You put a few people in there and a little bit more and a little bit more, and before you know where you are, you've got a full-blown war. That's how it happens.
The next question is from Lisa Byrne, and I'm going to give this one to you, Scott, and then I've got one for you, Alan. So Lisa asks, why is the military so heavily funded, but peace building isn't? Shouldn't the trillions of dollars that go into military and weapons be used for prevention and solutions to end war and violence, and for peace building and peacekeeping?
Yes, that is beautifully expressed and impossible to disagree with. When you think about, in particular, like we've been talking about everything from these very fine-grained deployments into places like Afghanistan and Iraq and potentially China, all the way through to these incredible investments in nuclear weapons capabilities that simply can never be used. In an age of climate change, where we need to very rapidly evolve the way that our industry and our societies operate, we simply cannot afford these industries anymore. Nobody can afford it. China can't afford it, neither can Iran, neither can Australia. That's going to take civil society power building, because these industries have fearsome momentum behind them, very high level political connections. And so I guess that's why a conversation like this is tremendously important. If we stay isolated and powerless, these things are going to continue to happen. There's a couple of bright spots, if I may, because some of this conversation has traversed some pretty bleak ground. So 3 bright spots, if I may. So here's one. There was a poll last December about transferring the war power and creating that parliamentary accountability. More than 83% of Australians are on our side. You know, that's astonishing. That's moved significantly over the decades, I suspect, as well. 83% of Australians are on the side of the people holding this conversation this morning. I think that's something that then it becomes an organising question. How does that 83% channel that enormous discontent into change? Another bright spot, 2018 ALP conference. So this is when Bill Shorten, as opposition leader, had proposed to refer the War Powers proposal to the Senate's Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee. Now, that's not a particularly big deal. I sent my version of the bill to that committee in 2009. And for people who are interested, there's a fascinating story. But having Labor propose to do that opens up a hairline crack in the bipartisanship. Somebody in there, probably Alison knows more about this than me, has done some very effective lobbying work with allies inside the ALP to open up that hairline crack. Here's a third one. An initiative that began in Australia, the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, that has changed international law, that has just come into force. Nuclear weapons are now as illegal as chemical and biological weapons. So the alternative Australian government proposes to sign that treaty, and that would bring the world's first nuclear umbrella state into a body of international law that says these weapons are illegal. That again would be a significant shift in Australian independent foreign and defence policy around nuclear weapons. So I don't want people coming off this call thinking there's no hope. Like, there is hope. When people of good heart work together, we can do everything from changing international law all the way up to, I suspect, changing the way that these war powers are engaged in Australia.
Ebony, can I add one more?
Yeah,
do it.
One more tick to Scott's list. And yes, that was an Australians for War Powers public opinion survey that produced that really encouraging result, which we did the other day. And you may have seen we lashed out on a full-page advertisement, first one we've ever done, to publicise that fact. One other note of optimism, because when we talk about things like this, it is terribly pessimistic stuff, and we don't want people to go away feeling disempowered. The Pope recently, on his courageous visit to Iraq, apologized for the Iraq war, which the Vatican didn't declare or fight, of course, but he apologized on the part of humanity, or of Catholics, I suppose, for the Iraq war and for the 18 years of despoliation of Iraq that have resulted from it. And there is a good example, perhaps, for the Catholics in our government who meet and say prayers together before the Parliament opens and things like that, to follow his example and to apologise on Australia's behalf, perhaps before the anniversary, well, this is the anniversary year, to apologise to Iraq for our illicit invasion and of Afghanistan and of Syria, and to say, if they have trouble doing that, well, we should have a report that tells us what we did, and then we'll know if we have something to apologise for and what it is. And if they have such a report like Chilcot, they'll sure find it.
The next question is perhaps a rhetorical one from Judith O'Byrne. She says, is there any greater irony than the munitions sector sponsoring the Australian War Memorial? Probably, I think you're right on the money there. I'd also add that our chief economist, Richard Dennis, has talked about how the gas industry sponsors the Eternal Flame for the unknown soldier there. So I think kind of offences on multiple fronts there. But Allan, there's a couple of people in the questions who are asking about how do we separate out Australia's interest in and foreign affairs policy from the United States?
I think, Ebony, the first thing we've got to do is to stop allowing sentimentality and romanticism to colour the way in which we look at our relationship with the United States. We talk a lot about shared values with the United States. The Prime Minister, after his first round of conversations with Prime Minister Modi, announced our shared values with India. But if you think hard about it, they're very, very hard to discover what they are. It's just a way of talking and filling the air. We do have some very serious structural alignments with the United States, and they're really built around about the way in which we run our courts, the way in which our courts relate to our parliament, the way in which we look at political structures of representation. These are very important alignments that we have with the United States, much, much less around what we might otherwise call values. And it's by focusing on those systemic relationships that we would, I think, become much clearer in the way in which we see our interests very often divergent from those of the United States, most particularly in Asia. And until we lose some of this sentimentality, some of this silliness that attaches to vague words like values, and we don't know the difference between the national interest and what our national interests in the plural, what that might mean. We just simply conflate them until we become clear on what we mean by our interests and what we mean by an enduring relationship with the United States. We will continue to gurgle down the plug hole of sentimentality. And that, I think, is one of the most dangerous parts of this long-term reliance on the United States for our cues, rather than a much more serious reliance on ourselves, a confident reliance on ourselves to plot our own way into the future and look to see where countries like the United States might actually fit in with that. So I would actually look for quite a serious recalibration.
This next question is mine, prerogative as a host. Scott, I want to come back to the Brereton report and the allegations kind of contained within that, and back to the idea of, well, how are we holding the government to account for that? Are there any parliamentary mechanisms, a Senate inquiry, that type of thing, where we could go back to revisit some of the issues that come out of the Brereton report of accountability for the executive? Because, you know, as we've said multiple times, we haven't had any kind of, you know, Chilcot report, but also it must be, you know, terrible for morale within the ADF. There's got to be a lot of other implications of these kinds of allegations of war crimes coming out.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with any of that, Ebony. I have not checked in with my colleagues to see how they're pursuing that. I think it gets difficult once prosecuting authorities get involved. I think it's going to be in the government's interests to just kind of bury it, to spool it out, to have internal inquiries that take a very long period of time, because they're managing the political risk of Australian soldiers being prosecuted for war crimes, which does significant damage to that sort of Teflon Anzac myth that Raytheon sponsor up at the War Memorial. And whether, yeah, I guess I'm not close enough to the committee process at the moment to know exactly what kind of value Parliament could add. But as a general rule, it can always add value to those kind of things, because the hearings tend to happen out in daylight. They happen in public. That's the purpose. That's the point of doing them. And I think they would also, I mean, your question went less about, I guess, the conduct of the soldiers and more about the command structures that put them there in the first place. That gets us very close then to an inquiry into why on earth we're there. What are we doing there? Why are we still there? And so, yeah, I guess it kind of brings the conversation full circle about the political decisions that put us into these situations which are then very different to the strategic and tactical decisions that put people into harm's way and end up with Australians committing war crimes.
Yeah. Alison, I might come to you just to reflect on that a little bit. And there's also a question here from Mark Diesendorf, who says, what roles, if any, do the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and the Lowy Institute play in Australia's participation in wars? And he comments that he's observed a tendency of both institutes to push for Australia to develop nuclear weapons, for example. Alison, Allan's talked a little bit, and Scott, about the role of civil society, but if you could speak to that and maybe just reflections on what Scott said about executive accountability in the wake of Brereton.
Okay, Brereton first then. It seems to me that if you send highly trained, motivated troops to a war without them clearly understanding why they're there or what they're supposed to do or what victory would look like in that war, you are going to have a problem. And the longer they are there and the more rotations those same people do back into the same war, the worse it's going to get. So if you're in a hole and you keep digging it, the result is what we have and Brereton found down there, which almost certainly is only a small part of what is down there. And the damage that we have done to our own service people, let alone to the people of Iraq and Afghanistan who were damaged by their presence in different ways, particularly Afghanistan, it seems, is immeasurable and unquantifiable and shameful. And this is what happens when governments start doing illegal things. They knew that that invasion was illegal in the first place. We shouldn't have been in Iraq, in Afghanistan anyway, because Afghanistan didn't do 9/11. That was a lie. We went there because the Americans said go, and we did. We didn't tell the soldiers what they were there to do, and they didn't know how to do it. And so naturally, and the same in Iraq, naturally, their behavior and the standards of their daily operations start to slip. And there is deceit and cover up and lack of accountability and responsibility all the way up the chain, right up to the very top, I suggest, of the Defence Force, which Brereton hasn't found, of course. And as Allan says, it will be buried for a very long time, and they hope that it will go away. Now, Mark Diesendorf, and thank you, Mark, for your highly relevant question, brings us around to one of the real threats that we face, much more threatening than, shall we say, Islamist terrorism. And that is the looming possibility of nuclear warfare. And Mark says, picking up on Scott's point about the nuclear weapons treaty, what is Australia going to do about dissociating itself from that? Well, unlike our New Zealand colleagues, nothing, because there is actually talk around the place of converting our French submarines to nuclear ones eventually. The possibility exists in the future of nuclear armed aircraft passing through Australian airspace to these new bases that they're building. And Australia will be implicated in all of that without knowing, by this slow drip effect that we've just talked about. As far as nuclear power is concerned, which some people in Australia keep clamoring for, they are not the ones, by the way, who ever tell you where these power plants are going to be built. The fact that we need 50 of them to make the slightest dent in our emissions in time to change anything, and the fact that government would have to bear the costs not only of constructing them and indemnifying the users and get huge insurance, but also what do we call it? Redeeming the site afterwards, which has been totally contaminated. And we haven't even got the capacity for a properly functioning nuclear waste dump in this country. So for people to start talking nuclear in Australia is really pipe dream stuff, and they're trying to catch up with a world which, in many parts of it, have given up on this already. So for Australia to stay off that bandwagon, and I know Mark agrees, is the best option, I would say.
We've got time for only one last question. So this, I'm not sure who I'm echoing on there. Sorry for that reverb in the background. The last question I'm going to direct to you, Allan. This one's from Terence Hull, who says, the declaration of war is perhaps the easier reform. The preparation for war in the purchase of submarines and fighters would seem to be more difficult for Parliament to control in the light of lobbying and the fiction that these are not dangerous provocations. I know, Allan, you've got some feelings about accountability when it comes to submarine contracts. What do you think?
Yes, Terence, it's a fantastic question, and we probably need another couple of hours for our webinar. I'll try to handle it in about 1.5 minutes. The fundamental issue here is how the citizen is engaged with the state in making these very fundamental determinations about our future. And that's really what accountability and transparency are designed to deliver to us as voters. And it would be my contention, and I have a suspicion it might be the co-panelists' contention, that we have very little of that at play at the moment. We have no say over how our long-term defence planning is conducted. And look, I've been a part of this for a great part of my career. And what little one adds to it just tends to disappear into an enormous sort of ambition that we want to look bigger and more powerful than probably we really are. We overinvest in armament and we underinvest in diplomacy. And all of that, I think, is a reflection of the fact that we don't have at play in Australia the sorts of transparency and accountability mechanisms that we really need if we as citizens are to have our rights protected both by ourselves and by our parliament. So it's a very fundamental and systemic issue of which war powers is just one bit.
Well, we might wrap it up there. Thank you so much to our panelists, Scott Ludlam, Dr. Alison Broinowski, and Allan Behm. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you everyone for your fantastic questions. There was a lot of excellent questions there that we just didn't have time to get to. And so I apologize for that. I want to thank everyone for coming today. Just a reminder that it will be up on our website, the recording of this webinar, and on our YouTube channel. That's australiainstitute.tv. You can find us there. But please make sure to join us in the next couple of weeks for some more exciting webinars. Next week, we'll be talking to our Chief Economist, Richard Dennis, about the long COVID economic crisis. That's Wednesday, March the 31st at 11 a.m. That should be a really good one. And if I may, please tune into our podcast, Follow the Money. This week, we've got a cracker episode with our research economist, Eliza Littleton, on 8 things that Prime Minister Scott Morrison could do right now to improve women's equality. I got very mad by the time I got to the end of the podcast, but it was a good one to record and definitely worth checking out. Thanks again to all of our panelists. Thanks all of you for joining us today. Thanks for a great and productive chat as well. And hopefully we'll see you next week. Thanks very much. Take care, everyone. Stay safe out there. Bye.